Hi, this is one of the foundational videos that we're recording for the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics to help us elucidate some of the underlying principles that we use, and we encapsulate them in the idea of the five prisms framework. And one of the foundational ideas that we use in IRLE as a way to explore and understand the principles underlying utility regulation is neoclassical economics. And one of the kind of foundations of economics is, of course, the typical market model with demand and supply. And this model it comes up a lot in regulatory discussions and analysis. And so that's why we always start there. And typically when you think about demand and supply, you think we have a market with a well-defined good or service, and we can represent what's going on in the interaction, in the exchange between buyers and sellers there, as an interaction between demand and supply, where demand represents the buyers and how much they're willing to pay to acquire the good, and the supply curve represents the sellers and how much they're willing to accept to be willing to produce the good and offer it for sale. And typically, in your typical econ class, that's where you start. You have a demand curve, you have a supply curve, you look at market clearing price, and then you do what economists call a welfare analysis, where you look at the consequences of exchange. And here we represent that, we represent that in general by the idea of gains from trade or welfare, the combination of consumer surplus and producer surplus that's generated when consumers and producers exchange with each other. And so this idea, this kind of ziggurat-y looking pyramid on its side on the right is the idea of gains from trade. And so this is a really fundamental part of the economics of regulation. But we want to dig a little deeper and ask some questions that you often don't think about when you just start with a supply curve and a demand curve. And one of the most important questions is asking, where do those prices come from? Where prices come from in markets is from the interaction of buyers and sellers, right? It's not like someone comes in and dictates a price from on high in most markets. In the kind of markets that humans have been creating and interacting in for millennia, the prices emerge out of the interactions. And the idea with gains from trade is that both buyers and sellers benefit from the transaction, that the transaction is a win-win. So it's not the price is not some externally created and externally imposed piece of information that then buyers and sellers respond to. Prices emerge out of the interaction of the buyers and sellers. And that's a very subtle concept, and it's often really hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around. So I think it's important to start there. And as I said, the interaction of buyers and sellers lead to a market clearing price emerging out of their interaction. And so thinking about price as an emergent phenomenon is a really important way to understand the economics of all economics, but certainly the economics of regulation. So what exactly, if prices are emerging out of the interaction of buyers and sellers, what do those prices reflect? They're reflecting both the financial costs and benefits to both buyers and sellers. Buyers have opportunities to buy substitute goods in a lot of cases. And so those opportunities will be reflected in their willingness to pay for this good in this market. And similarly with sellers, they have financial costs of producing the good, but they also have opportunity costs, right? If they are going to use their inputs to produce this good, they are giving up the opportunity to do something else with that. And that's really important, especially in regulatory economics, when we think about the use of capital, because that fundamental economic principle feeds into the financial models for the rate of return to the regulated utility. The idea there being that capital can be used in some other way, and in order to have an accurate representation of the value of that capital in used in electricity, you have to incorporate the idea that the capital has an opportunity cost, that it could be used in some other way. And if we're going to use it in the delivery of electricity, then that capital owner has to be compensated for the opportunity cost of using the capital that way. The other thing to notice here is that these costs and benefits to the buyer, which relates to their preferences, but also the costs and opportunity costs to the seller are both subjective. That means that each individual's perception of what those costs are define those costs. Right? We usually think of costs as being accounting costs, some number in a spreadsheet somewhere. But that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that opportunity costs are subjective and they are perceptual. And that's something that's hard to capture quantitatively in a regulatory framework. So it's important to bear that in mind. One of the most important things to recognize about prices that we often don't appreciate well enough is the extent to which prices turn private knowledge into useful information. And this distinction between knowledge and information is really important. And again, something that we don't think about a lot. When I would encourage you to think about knowledge as something that's very private, very personal. Again, this idea of perception, that we have a decentralized system where individuals have their own preferences, their own perceptions of what their opportunities are, and therefore what their opportunity costs are. And only they know that. Only you know your own preferences and opportunity costs. And even there, you don't necessarily know that until you are in a context where you have to make some kind of choice, right? Because you're just usually not thinking about that. So they're very private, they're very decentralized, and at least to some extent, they're very subjective. Often they're tacit or inarticulate. You can't really put them into words. My favorite example of this, I'm biased because I'm a cyclist, is the example of how do you keep your balance on a bicycle? Right. And, physicists can write all kinds of models and equations to represent the physical reality of how you keep your balance on a bicycle. But if I ask you as a cyclist, how do you keep your balance on a bicycle? You can't really articulate how you do it, but you just know that you can do it. You don't know how you do it, but you know that you can do it. And that distinction between knowing that and knowing how is an example of the idea that a lot of the knowledge that we bring to bear in our everyday decisions day to day is tacit or inarticulate. One of the best encapsulations of this idea of tacit knowledge comes from the seminal 1945 article, Use of Knowledge in Society by F.A. Hayek, where he says that knowledge is the knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. And I think if you think about, the knowledge of a single person on the street, that person's knowledge of the context in which that person is making a specific decision and making a choice, nobody else has that knowledge except for that person. And so that's a really good example of this idea of knowledge. And so we have individual private knowledge. What do markets do? Markets provide an opportunity for us to benefit ourselves. And by so doing, we essentially create information out of that private knowledge. So if I go and I want to buy a cup of tea, I can decide whether or not I'm willing to pay what the seller is offering me to buy a cup of tea. And if I do, then I've communicated some piece of my knowledge that I'm willing to pay at least that amount for that cup of tea. And so that's the process of turning knowledge into information. And that's what the price system does. And by creating this piece of information that here was a person who was willing to pay $3 for a cup of tea, that then becomes a piece of solid quantitative information that is actionable for other people. And that's the sense in which prices turn private knowledge into useful information, because information is something that's observable. It's data, it's easy to articulate, and prices provide an opportunity for us to make decisions that require us to communicate some piece of that private knowledge. And that's the sense in which we can think of prices as knowledge surrogates. They communicate some piece of that knowledge. You know, I was willing to pay up to $3 for that cup of tea because clearly I paid the $3, I bought the cup of tea. And so that's a really important function that prices play. They, in the course of the coordination of buyers and sellers that prices do, what they're doing is they're communicating all of that decentralized private knowledge that buyers and sellers have about their preferences and their opportunity costs. And so this is how we generate the consequences of the market process that we're familiar with. Markets make that private, local, usually tacit knowledge available to other people. And it's the prices that do that. Prices are a very important mechanism for communicating decentralized knowledge. Prices create information. And that information is really what allows for the widespread phenomenon of cooperation and coordination. And that's the sense in which markets and market processes are processes of social cooperation. And they are cooperative in the sense that they enable buyers and sellers to coordinate the production of and the consumption of scarce resources. And that process is essential, and it is a cooperative process, even though we do generally focus a lot on competition, right? The rivalry between buyers to try to get the cheaper deal, the rivalry between sellers to try to make sure that they're the ones that get their products sold. But that is really the process that generates the gains from trade, the producer surplus, the consumer surplus that we use to evaluate the benefits of market processes. So one implication of this that is essential, I think, for thinking about regulatory economics, especially as we transition into more market inclusive regulatory institutions, is that you know, thinking about this idea that prices are informative is an important principle for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about market design, because that then tells us that we want to think about market design as embedding rules that keep transaction costs low and can keep prices as informative as possible. That, I think, is a good place to leave it for today. And it leaves a lot of open questions for us to follow up on with subsequent conversations.